She was ignored at the wedding, until the Vampire King claimed her. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The wedding hall shimmered with soft golden lights and polished crystal chandeliers that reflected across the marble floor like scattered stars. Music drifted through the room as guests in elegant gowns and tailored suits laughed and raised glasses of sparkling wine. It was the kind of wedding people in the city would talk about for years. Isabella Harper had always dreamed of a perfect wedding, and tonight she finally had it. Every detail had been arranged with care. The flowers were imported from California vineyards. The tables were covered in white linen and silver candle holders. A string quartet played gentle melodies near the altar. Everyone important in the city seemed to be there. Business owners, lawyers, socialites, and even a few local politicians. Yet standing quietly near the far wall, almost hidden behind a tall arrangement of white roses, was Isabella's younger sister, Emily Harper. Emily wore a simple navy dress that she had borrowed from a friend because she could not afford to buy something new. Her brown hair was tied back neatly, and her hands were folded in front of her as if she was unsure whether she truly belonged in the room. No one spoke to her. No one offered her a seat at the main tables. Some guests glanced at her briefly before looking away as if she were simply part of the staff working the event. In truth, Emily had spent most of the afternoon helping the catering team prepare trays of food and refill glasses for the guests. Her own family had asked her to help because the wedding was so large and expensive. It was easier that way, her mother had said. Emily did not argue. She rarely argued about anything. She had grown used to standing quietly in the background while Isabella shined brightly at the center of attention. Tonight was no different. As the ceremony ended and applause filled the hall, Emily watched from the edge of the room while her sister and the groom, Daniel Hayes, shared their first kiss as husband and wife. The crowd cheered loudly. Cameras flashed. Laughter echoed through the room. Emily clapped politely along with everyone else, though her smile was small and almost invisible. No one noticed when a waiter carrying a tray of champagne accidentally brushed past her shoulder and did not even apologize. No one noticed when one of the wedding coordinators asked her to move aside because she was blocking the view of an important guest. And certainly no one noticed the strange feeling that suddenly passed through the air like a cold whisper drifting across the hall. Somewhere far beyond the celebration, in a place hidden from the human world, a powerful presence lifted his head slowly as if he had heard a distant call carried through centuries of silence. For more than 600 years, the ancient vampire king Adrian Valerius had ruled over his hidden kingdom with absolute control. Very little surprised him anymore. Yet at that exact moment, his crimson eyes opened sharply and fixed on nothing, as though sensing something impossible. A pulse, a trace of bloodline energy that had not appeared in the world for hundreds of years. Adrian stood from his throne in silence. The ancient vow that bound his fate to a forgotten human bloodline had awakened. And the signal was coming from a wedding hall in a quiet American city, where a young woman named Emily Harper stood alone while the entire room ignored her existence. Emily Harper remained near the far wall of the wedding hall long after the applause for Isabella and Daniel slowly faded into the warm hum of celebration. Guests gathered around the newly married couple while waiters carried trays of champagne between tables filled with laughter and congratulations. The band began to play a cheerful tune, and the dance floor quickly filled with people who moved beneath the golden lights as if the entire evening belonged to them. Emily watched quietly, holding an empty tray that she had taken from one of the catering staff to help clear the tables. No one had asked her to do it. She simply knew it was easier than standing alone and pretending she was part of the celebration. That had always been her role in the Harper family. Isabella shined while Emily worked in the background. It had been that way for as long as she could remember. Years earlier, when they were both in high school, Isabella had been the star of every event. She had been the homecoming queen, the captain of the cheer squad, the girl who could walk into a room and instantly gather attention without even trying. Emily had been the quieter sister who preferred books and late-night shifts at the neighborhood diner, where she eventually found her first real job after graduation. While Isabella chased dreams of luxury and social status, Emily learned how to refill coffee cups, carry heavy trays, and smile politely even when customers barely looked up from their phones. Their parents had always said that Emily was dependable. It was meant as a compliment, but somehow it always sounded like a polite way of saying she was ordinary. Isabella deserved grand opportunities, while Emily could take care of practical things. Tonight, that unspoken rule had followed them into adulthood. The wedding had been expensive beyond anything Emily could imagine paying for herself. The reception hall alone cost more money than she earned in an entire year of working double shifts at the diner and occasional weekend catering jobs. When her mother explained that the family budget had been stretched thin paying for the celebration, Emily had simply nodded and volunteered to help wherever she could. That was why she had arrived early in the afternoon, wearing comfortable shoes instead of heels, and helped the catering manager unload boxes of plates from a delivery truck parked behind the building. It was why she now stood near the tables collecting empty glasses while strangers congratulated Isabella and Daniel just a few steps away. One of the guests brushed past Emily without noticing her and set an empty champagne flute on her tray as if she were part of the staff. Emily accepted it without complaint. She carried the tray toward the service door that led into the kitchen area where cooks and servers moved quickly between steaming trays of food and stacks of clean plates. The catering manager gave her a grateful smile and thanked her for the help before turning back to direct a pair of young servers who were trying to organize the dessert table. Emily placed the glasses onto a counter and took a quiet breath before returning to the reception hall. The music grew louder as more guests joined the dance floor. Isabella spun beneath the lights while Daniel laughed and lifted her hand high into the air as if presenting her to the world. People cheered again. Emily felt a familiar mixture of happiness and distance. She truly wanted her sister to have a beautiful life. Yet as she stood there watching the celebration, she could not ignore the strange sensation that had settled over her skin like a cool breeze moving through a warm room. The air felt heavier somehow. The candles along the tables flickered even though there was no open door or window nearby. Emily rubbed her hands together and glanced around the hall. For a brief moment, she thought she heard a low vibration beneath the music like a distant heartbeat echoing through stone walls far below the city streets. The feeling faded almost as quickly as it arrived. Emily shook her head gently and stepped forward to carry another tray of empty glasses away from the tables, unaware that far beyond the human world, the ancient vampire king Adrian Valerius was already moving toward the city with a purpose that had not stirred within him for more than 6 centuries. Far beneath the quiet surface of the modern world, far below highways, office towers, and glowing city lights, an ancient chamber carved from black stone stretched like the heart of a forgotten empire. Tall pillars lined the vast hall, each etched with symbols older than any human language still spoken. Torches burned along the walls with steady crimson flames that never flickered, casting shadows that moved slowly across the floor like silent guardians of history. At the far end of the chamber stood a throne carved from a single piece of obsidian. Upon that throne sat Adrian Valerius, the vampire king. For more than 600 years, he had ruled over the hidden clans that lived between the human world and the ancient darkness beneath it. His presence alone carried the weight of centuries. His pale skin appeared almost luminous against the dark stone behind him, and his long black coat flowed over the edges of the throne like a shadow given form. His eyes, deep crimson and steady as burning coals, were fixed on the empty space before him, as if listening too, something no other creature could hear. Around the chamber stood members of the royal council. Ancient vampires who had witnessed the rise and fall of human empires remained perfectly still as they waited for their king to speak. One of them, a tall silver-haired vampire named Marcus Thorne, stepped forward with a respectful bow. "My king, the council awaits your decision regarding the Northern Territories." Adrian did not answer immediately. His head tilted slightly as if the distant signal that had stirred moments earlier was still echoing in his mind. Something had changed in the world above. Something he had believed lost forever. Marcus noticed the shift in the king's expression and hesitated. "My king." Adrian slowly rose from the obsidian throne. The movement was quiet, yet carried absolute authority. Every member of the council straightened instantly. "A bloodline has awakened," Adrian said at last, his voice calm, but resonating through the chamber like distant thunder. The council exchanged uneasy glances. "Bloodline," Marcus repeated carefully. Which bloodline could command the attention of a king who had ruled for centuries without surprise? Adrian stepped down from the throne and walked slowly toward the center of the chamber. His footsteps echoed softly across the stone floor. "The ancient vow," he said, "the vow sealed during the last war between our kind and the human kingdoms." A murmur moved through the council. Many of them had only heard fragments of that history, stories whispered in the oldest archives. Marcus frowned slightly. "My king, that vow ended centuries ago. The human family bound to it vanished from history." Adrian stopped walking. His crimson eyes sharpened. "They did not vanish," he said quietly. "They were hidden. The signal I felt tonight is unmistakable. The blood of that line lives again." Marcus felt a chill move through his immortal body. For the first time in centuries, uncertainty touched the chamber. If the bloodline truly survived, then the ancient pact could awaken again. That pact had once tied the fate of the vampire throne to a single human heir. And if the heir appeared, the king would be bound to protect that life with absolute authority. Marcus spoke cautiously. "Where is this human now?" Adrian turned his gaze upward, as though seeing through the stone ceiling into the world above. "In a city filled with light and music," he said slowly. "A celebration is taking place. A wedding." The council grew silent. A wedding meant human gatherings, noise, distraction. Not the kind of place where ancient magic should appear. Yet Adrian could still feel the faint pulse of the awakened bloodline. Weak but undeniable. 600 years of patience had suddenly ended in a single moment. "Prepare the convoy," Adrian ordered. The council froze. "My king," Marcus began, "you cannot mean to travel there yourself." Adrian looked back toward the throne one final time. For centuries, he had ruled from the shadows while the human world moved forward without knowing he existed. But tonight the old vow had called to him again, and a king who honored ancient promises did not ignore such a summons. "The bloodline has awakened," Adrian said, "and if the human carrying it stand alone among those who would overlook her, then it is time the world remembers who protects that line." Far above the ancient chamber, the wedding music continued to play, while Emily Harper carried another tray of empty glasses past the laughing crowd, completely unaware that the most powerful vampire in existence had just begun his journey toward the very hall where she stood. The celebration inside the wedding hall grew louder as the evening continued. Glasses clinked together in cheerful toasts, and the dance floor shimmered beneath warm golden lights. Guests laughed freely as the band shifted into a faster song that encouraged more people to join the dancing crowd. At the center of the room, Isabella Harper glowed with happiness as friends surrounded her, praising the beauty of the ceremony and the elegance of the reception. Daniel Hayes stood proudly beside his new wife, greeting business partners and relatives who congratulated him on the perfect evening. Meanwhile, Emily Harper continued, moving quietly along the edges of the hall with a tray balanced carefully in her hands. The tray held several empty glasses left behind by guests who were far too busy celebrating to notice who carried them away. Emily moved toward a side table where more dishes had begun to pile up. As she reached forward to place the glasses down, she heard a voice behind her. "Emily." She turned to see her mother approaching with a tense expression. Martha Harper wore an expensive evening gown that shimmered under the lights, yet her face showed clear irritation. Emily lowered the tray. "Yes, Mom." Martha glanced around quickly to make sure no one important was close enough to hear. "You need to be more careful where you stand," she said quietly. Some of Daniel's colleagues are arriving, and we cannot have them thinking the family hired inexperienced help. Emily blinked in confusion. I was just clearing the tables so the servers could keep up. Martha sighed impatiently. That is exactly the problem. If people see you carrying trays, they will assume you work here. This is your sister's wedding. Try not to embarrass us tonight. The words settled heavily in Emily's chest. She nodded slowly, even though she was not sure what she had done wrong. I understand. Her mother gave a short nod and walked away without another word. Emily remained standing beside the table for a moment while the laughter of the guests continued around her. She lifted the tray again and began carrying the glasses toward the kitchen doors. As she walked across the floor, two young women in elegant dresses stepped directly in front of her path without noticing she was there. Their sudden movement caused Emily to stop quickly to avoid colliding with them. One of the women glanced briefly at Emily and frowned as if annoyed by an obstacle in her way. "Excuse us," she said in a tone that suggested Emily should not have been standing there at all. Emily stepped aside quietly and allowed them to pass. When she finally reached the service door, she placed the tray onto a counter and took a slow breath. The kitchen staff were rushing to prepare another round of appetizers while the catering manager checked a list of schedules pinned to the wall. One of the servers thanked Emily again for helping earlier and handed her a glass of water. "You have been working harder than half of the paid staff tonight," the young server joked kindly. Emily smiled faintly and accepted the drink. "I do not mind. It keeps me busy." She stepped back into the reception hall a few minutes later, just as the music shifted into a slower melody. Couples moved closer together on the dance floor, while waiters dimmed the lights slightly to create a softer atmosphere. Emily paused near the wall once more and watched the guests enjoying the evening. At the center of a room, Isabella rested her head against Daniel's shoulder while cameras flashed from every direction. It was the picture of a perfect celebration. Yet, as Emily looked across the hall, she felt the strange sensation again. The cool pressure in the air returned, like an invisible wave passing through the room. The candles flickered even though the doors were closed, and the music briefly seemed to fade in her ears. Emily turned slowly toward the entrance of the hall. For reasons she could not explain, she suddenly felt as though someone powerful had stepped into the world nearby. Far outside, the building dark vehicles moved silently through the city streets toward the glowing reception hall. Inside the lead vehicle sat Adrian Valerius, his crimson eyes fixed forward as the faint pulse of the ancient bloodline guided him closer with every passing moment. Emily Harper remained near the edge of the reception hall while the music continued to drift through the air like a warm tide of celebration. Guests laughed and danced beneath the golden chandeliers while waiters carried trays of sparkling wine through the crowd. From the outside, the wedding looked flawless, the kind of celebration people imagine when they thought about a perfect beginning to a marriage. Yet for Emily, the evening had slowly become something quieter and stranger. The strange sensation she had noticed earlier returned once again. It began as a subtle pressure in the air, almost like the feeling before a thunderstorm arrives on a hot summer evening. Emily placed a tray of empty glasses on a nearby table and rubbed her hands together as a chill moved along her arms. The room itself was warm. The heaters along the walls kept the hall comfortable despite the cool night outside. Yet the air around Emily felt colder with every passing moment. She glanced toward the large glass windows that overlooked the city street. The view outside showed traffic moving normally and groups of guests arriving from nearby hotels. Nothing appeared unusual. Still, the strange feeling remained. A soft vibration seemed to hum somewhere deep beneath the music of the band. Emily could not hear it clearly, yet she felt it in her chest like the faint echo of a distant drumbeat. She took a slow breath and tried to ignore the sensation. Perhaps she was simply tired after working since the early afternoon. Weddings required hours of preparation, and the celebration had only just begun. Emily picked up another tray and began walking toward a cluster of tables near the back of the hall, where several empty plates had been left behind. As she reached forward to gather them, a sudden spark of warmth flashed briefly across her wrist. Emily blinked and looked down. For an instant, she thought she saw a faint golden line of light beneath her skin, shaped almost like a curved symbol she did not recognize. The glow faded so quickly that she wondered if she had imagined it. She turned her wrist slowly beneath the light of the chandelier, but saw nothing except her normal pale skin. Emily shook her head gently and laughed at herself. It had probably been a reflection from the candles along the table. Across the room, the celebration continued without interruption. Isabella and Daniel moved from table to table greeting their guests, while cameras captured every smiling moment. The band leader announced that the next dance would be dedicated to the bride and groom. Applause filled the hall again as people stepped aside to watch the couple move gracefully onto the center of the dance floor. Emily carried the plates toward the service door once more. Yet the strange sensation inside her chest continued to grow stronger. Each heartbeat seemed to echo louder than the last, as if something ancient had begun to stir beneath the quiet rhythm of her life. At that exact moment, several miles away, a convoy of dark vehicles turned onto the final street that led toward the glowing reception hall. Inside the lead vehicle, Adrian Valerius sat perfectly still as the city lights reflected across the window beside him. The faint pulse of the awakened bloodline had grown stronger with every passing mile. Now the signal felt unmistakable. It moved through his senses like a beacon that had waited centuries to shine again. Adrian closed his eyes briefly and allowed the ancient magic of the vow to guide him. The presence he felt was fragile but undeniable. The human carrying that bloodline stood within a gathering of many people, surrounded by music and celebration, yet completely unaware of the storm her existence was about to awaken. Adrian opened his crimson eyes slowly. "We are close," he said calmly. The driver nodded and turned the vehicle into the entrance of the elegant reception hall. Outside the building, guests continued to arrive in polished cars and evening gowns while soft lights illuminated the pathway leading toward the doors. None of them realized that a king older than their entire nation had just arrived to claim the one life bound to his throne by a promise forged more than 6 centuries earlier. Far above the hidden chamber, where the vampire council still stood in uneasy silence, the convoy of dark vehicles rolled quietly to a stop beside the glowing reception hall. The building stood tall against the night sky, its glass windows shining with warm light and laughter. From the outside, it looked like nothing more than an elegant celebration. Music drifted faintly through the doors, and the sound of happy voices filled the cool evening air. Yet the moment Adrian Valerius stepped out of the lead vehicle, the night itself seemed to shift. The driver opened the door without speaking. Adrian emerged with calm, deliberate movements, his long black coat moving softly around him in the cool wind. The city lights reflected across his pale features, and for a moment anyone watching might have mistaken him for an ordinary guest arriving late to the wedding. But the men who stepped out of the other vehicles behind him were anything but ordinary. Each one carried the same silent discipline and unnatural stillness that belonged only to the ancient clans. Marcus Thorne stepped forward from the second vehicle, his silver hair catching the glow of the streetlights. "My king," he said quietly, scanning the entrance of the hall where guests continued to arrive in elegant clothing. "The human gathering appears large." Adrian looked toward the building without answering immediately. Through layers of stone and glass, he could feel the pulse again, faint but unmistakable. The bloodline was inside, surrounded by hundreds of human heartbeats, yet standing apart from them all. His crimson eyes narrowed slightly as the ancient vow resonated through his senses like an echo across time. "She is here," Adrian said calmly. Marcus studied the entrance again. "Then the bloodline truly survived," he said quietly. "For centuries, the council believed the line was erased during the war." Adrian walked slowly toward the entrance path illuminated by small golden lamps. "They believed what they wished to believe," he replied. "But a vow written in blood does not fade simply because time passes." Marcus followed a step behind him. Several other vampires remained near the vehicles, blending into the shadows as silent guardians. Human guests continued entering the hall only a few yards away, completely unaware of the ancient presence moving among them. As Adrian approached the doors, the pulse grew stronger. The signal no longer felt distant. It was close enough now that he could sense fragments of emotion carried within it. Confusion, quiet endurance, a life that had spent many years being overlooked. Adrian paused for a moment beneath the entrance lights. The ancient magic tied to the vow stirred again, recognizing the presence of its king. Inside the hall, the celebration continued without interruption. Emily Harper had just returned from the service area, carrying a fresh tray of glasses back toward the tables. The strange warmth she had noticed earlier had returned again, stronger this time. She paused briefly beside a pillar as the sensation moved through her chest like a wave of energy she could not explain. Around her, the wedding guests laughed and danced while the band played a slow romantic melody. Yet Emily felt something different moving through the room. The air seemed heavier, almost electric, as though the building itself was waiting for something to happen. She looked toward the entrance doors without knowing why. At that exact moment, the large doors at the front of the hall opened slowly to admit a new group of guests arriving from the night outside. None of the wedding guests paid much attention. New arrivals had been coming and going all evening. But when Adrian Valerius stepped across the threshold, the ancient vow finally ignited with undeniable force. Inside the hall, Emily felt the warmth in her chest surge suddenly into a sharp pulse that made her grip the edge of the nearby table. For the briefest moment, the faint golden symbol beneath her skin flickered again, like a hidden flame, awakening after centuries of silence, while across the crowded hall, the crimson eyes of the vampire king lifted and found her instantly among the hundreds of unaware humans. Emily Harper stood frozen beside the table as the strange pulse moved through her chest again, stronger than before. The tray in her hands trembled slightly, and she set it down quickly to avoid dropping the glasses. For a moment she thought she might be feeling faint from exhaustion, but the sensation did not feel like weakness. It felt like something waking up. Across the hall, the doors had just opened to admit several new guests from the night outside. Most people barely noticed. The music continued, and the guests were too busy talking and laughing to care about another arrival. But the moment Adrian Valerius stepped into the room, the air itself seemed to tighten. He walked forward slowly, his presence calm, yet impossible to ignore. The soft lights of the chandeliers reflected across his dark coat, while Marcus Thorne followed quietly a few steps behind him. None of the wedding guests recognized them. To human eyes, they were simply late arrivals dressed in elegant black. Yet the ancient power that surrounded the vampire king moved through the hall like an invisible tide. Adrian did not look at the dancing couples or the decorated tables. His crimson gaze moved across the crowd with quiet precision until it settled on a single figure standing near the far wall. Emily Harper. For centuries, Adrian had ruled with patience and restraint. But in that moment, the ancient vow surged through his senses with absolute certainty. The human woman, standing alone among the guests, carried the bloodline that had once saved his throne during the war that nearly destroyed the vampire clans. The signal inside him burned stronger with every step he took toward the center of the hall. Meanwhile, Emily tried to steady her breathing as the strange warmth continued pulsing through her chest. She reached for another tray of glasses, hoping the simple task would calm the odd feelings spreading through her body. But before she could lift the tray, a sudden voice cut across the music behind her. "Emily, what exactly are you doing now?" She turned quickly and saw Daniel Hayes standing nearby with several of his business associates. His expression held the tight smile of someone embarrassed in front of important guests. Emily straightened nervously. "I was just clearing the tables so the staff could keep up." Daniel sighed and rubbed his forehead as if she had just created a problem for him. "This is not a restaurant shift. This is my wedding reception." His friends glanced at Emily with mild curiosity while Daniel continued speaking in a low, irritated voice. "People are starting to ask why the bride's sister is carrying trays like hired help." Emily felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment. "I was only trying to help." Isabella approached at that moment, her wedding dress shimmering as she moved through the crowd. "What is going on here?" Daniel gestured toward Emily. Your sister is still acting like one of the servers. Isabella looked at Emily, and her expression tightened slightly. Emily, I thought we talked about this earlier. Just try to stay out of the way tonight. The words were not shouted, but they carried clearly enough for several nearby guests to hear. A few people turned to watch the exchange with quiet interest. Emily lowered her eyes. I'm sorry. I will leave the tray here. One of Daniel's friends chuckled softly and muttered something about family drama. The laughter stung more than the words themselves. Emily stepped away from the table, hoping the conversation would end quickly so the attention would move back to the dance floor. But at that exact moment, the strange pulse inside her chest flared again. Across the hall, Adrian Valerius stopped walking. He had witnessed the exchange clearly. The ancient vow reacted instantly to the humiliation directed at the woman bound to his throne. Marcus noticed the subtle change in the king's expression and leaned closer. My king. Adrian's crimson gaze remained fixed on Emily as she stood alone under the soft light of the chandeliers while the guests around her whispered and laughed. For more than 6 centuries, Adrian had honored the ancient promise that bound his power to the protection of this bloodline. And now the human carrying that bloodline was being dismissed and mocked in a room full of people who did not even realize who stood among them. Adrian spoke quietly, but the authority in his voice was absolute. Enough. Then he began walking directly toward Emily Harper. Emily Harper stepped backward from the table as the soft laughter from Daniel Hayes and his friends faded into murmurs among the nearby guests. The music continued to play, but the moment had already changed the atmosphere around her. Several people standing close enough to hear the exchange now looked at Emily with quiet curiosity. Some whispered behind their glasses while others simply watched as though a small piece of entertainment had appeared in the middle of the celebration. Emily lowered her eyes and moved toward the edge of the hall, hoping to disappear from the attention gathering around her. She had learned long ago that the easiest way to survive uncomfortable moments was to step away quietly and allow the room to forget she existed. Yet the humiliation lingered in the air like a stain that would not wash away. Isabella Harper turned back toward her guests with a forced smile and lifted her glass as if nothing unusual had happened. Daniel followed her lead, quickly guiding his colleagues toward the dance floor where the band had begun another song. The laughter and music rose again, but a few guests still glanced toward the corner where Emily stood alone beside a decorative pillar. One woman leaned toward her companion and whispered something that caused them both to laugh softly. Emily felt the warmth rise in her face again. She folded her hands together and stared down at the polished marble floor, wishing the evening would simply pass so she could leave without drawing more attention. Her chest still carried the strange pulse she had felt earlier, but now the sensation seemed tied to the embarrassment tightening around her heart. She took a slow breath and stepped toward the hallway that led to the restrooms and coat room, hoping a few minutes alone would calm her thoughts. Behind her, the reception hall continued glowing with celebration. The band played cheerful music while waiters passed trays of sparkling wine through the crowd. Guests filled the dance floor again, and cameras flashed as people captured more photographs of the newly married couple. To nearly everyone in the room, the moment with Emily had already become a small, forgotten distraction. But across the hall, Adrian Valerius had seen everything. The vampire king moved through the crowd with silent purpose, his presence causing subtle shifts among the people he passed. None of them consciously noticed him, yet conversations paused and guests instinctively stepped aside as he walked forward. Marcus Thorne followed closely behind, observing the human gathering with careful attention. The king's focus remained locked on the woman standing alone near the hallway entrance. Marcus lowered his voice slightly. My king, the humans here are unaware of who you are. If we reveal ourselves openly, it may create panic. Adrian did not slow his steps. The ancient vow that bound his throne to the protection of Emily's bloodline now burned through his senses like a living flame. The humiliation she had endured only moments earlier echoed within that bond with unmistakable clarity. A king who honored ancient promises did not stand idle while the life under his protection was dismissed and shamed before strangers. Across the hall, Emily had just reached the quiet hallway when the strange pulse surged through her chest again, stronger than before. She stopped walking and pressed one hand lightly against her heart. The sensation was no longer faint. It felt powerful and alive, as though something within her had awakened fully for the first time. She turned slowly back toward the reception hall, confusion filling her thoughts. The laughter and music continued behind her, yet the air now carried a different energy that made the room feel suddenly smaller. At that exact moment, Adrian Valerius stepped out from the crowd and into the open space near the center of the hall. The ancient power that surrounded him moved outward like a silent wave, and though the human guests could not understand why, many of them turned their heads instinctively toward the tall figure walking across the polished floor with calm authority. Emily looked up just as his crimson eyes found hers again across the crowded room, and for the first time that night, she realized someone in the entire hall was actually looking directly at her. Emily Harper remained standing near the hallway entrance, her heart beating faster than the music echoing through the reception hall. For a moment, the entire room seemed to blur around her as she tried to understand why the strange warmth inside her chest had suddenly grown so powerful. Guests continued laughing and dancing only a few yards away, yet Emily felt as if she had stepped into a different moment entirely. Across the polished marble floor, Adrian Valerius moved forward through the crowd with calm and unstoppable purpose. The subtle conversations around him began to slow as guests instinctively stepped aside to allow the tall stranger in black to pass. No one knew his name. No one understood the ancient authority that surrounded him like an invisible crown. Yet something about his presence demanded space. Daniel Hayes noticed the movement first. He had just lifted a glass of champagne while speaking to several colleagues when he saw the unfamiliar figure walking directly toward the center of the reception hall. Daniel frowned slightly and leaned toward one of the event coordinators standing nearby. "Do we know that guest?" he asked quietly. The coordinator glanced across the room, but shook her head. "I do not believe he is on the seating list." Daniel straightened his jacket, clearly irritated by the unexpected interruption. This reception was meant to impress important clients and business partners. An unknown guest moving confidently through the hall without greeting anyone immediately caught his attention. Meanwhile, Isabella Harper had also noticed the sudden shift in the room. Conversations were fading. More people were turning to watch the stranger walk forward. Even the musicians on the stage seemed slightly distracted as they continued playing the soft melody. Emily stood frozen near the hallway as Adrian approached. With every step he took, the strange pulse inside her chest intensified. It felt as though an invisible thread connected them across the crowded room. She had never seen the man before in her life, yet something deep inside her recognized him in a way her mind could not explain. Adrian finally stopped a few feet away from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of the celebration continued around them, but the space between them felt strangely quiet. Emily looked up into his crimson eyes and felt the warmth inside her chest surge again, stronger than ever before. Adrian studied her carefully. The ancient vow resonated through every part of his immortal being. There was no doubt left. The human woman standing before him carried the bloodline bound to his throne. She was the descendant of the family that had once saved his people during the darkest war in vampire history. And tonight she had been dismissed and humiliated in a room full of humans who had no idea who she truly was. Marcus Thorne stopped a short distance behind the king, watching the crowd carefully. Several guests had now noticed the quiet moment forming near the hallway. Daniel Hayes stepped forward, clearly determined to regain control of the situation. "Excuse me, sir," Daniel said firmly as he approached Adrian. "This is a private reception. If you're looking for someone, you should speak with the event staff first." Adrian did not turn his head. His gaze remained on Emily as though Daniel's voice had barely reached him. Daniel frowned and stepped closer. "Sir, I asked you a question." Emily felt the tension rising quickly. She opened her mouth to apologize, hoping to calm the situation before it created another scene. "I am sorry," she began, softly, but Adrian finally spoke before she could finish. His voice was quiet yet carried a weight that silenced the small circle of guests who had gathered nearby. "You owe her an apology," Adrian said calmly. Daniel blinked in confusion. "What did you say?" Adrian slowly turned his gaze toward the groom. The temperature of the room seemed to drop slightly as his crimson eyes fixed on Daniel Hayes. "You dismissed her. You mocked her in front of your guests." His voice remained steady, but every word carried unmistakable authority. "The woman you treated as invisible is under my protection." Daniel laughed nervously, assuming the stranger was simply another guest who had misunderstood the situation. "Look, I do not know who you think you are, but this is my wedding reception." Adrian stepped forward and placed himself beside Emily Harper. Then his voice carried clearly across the room as more guests turned to watch the confrontation unfolding beneath the golden chandeliers. "I am the one who claims her," Adrian Valerius said calmly. "And from this moment forward, no one in this room will treat her as less than the woman she truly is." The reception hall fell into a heavy silence after Adrian Valerius spoke those words. Conversations faded into whispers as guests turned their full attention toward the unexpected confrontation unfolding near the center of the room. The musicians on the stage slowly lowered the volume of their instruments, uncertain whether the moment was part of the celebration or the beginning of a serious disturbance. Emily Harper stood beside Adrian, her mind struggling to understand what had just happened. Only seconds earlier, she had been preparing to disappear quietly into the hallway. Now every pair of eyes in a room seemed to be focused directly on her. Daniel Hayes stared at Adrian with disbelief. The confident smile he had worn all evening faded quickly as he tried to process the stranger's calm declaration. "I am sorry," Daniel said slowly, forcing a polite tone in front of his guests, "but I think there has been some kind of misunderstanding. This woman is my wife's sister." Adrian did not move. His gaze remained steady and unshaken as he answered, "I am aware of who she is." Daniel laughed awkwardly, glancing around at the watching crowd. "Then I'm sure you also understand that this is a private family matter." Emily felt the tension tightening around her again. She did not want to cause trouble on her sister's wedding night. She gently touched Adrian's sleeve and spoke quietly. "It is all right. Please do not argue because of me." Adrian turned his head slightly and looked down at her. The moment their eyes met the strange warmth inside, Emily's chest surged again, stronger than ever before. For a brief instant, the faint golden symbol beneath the skin of her wrist flickered once more, though none of the nearby guests noticed. Adrian's voice softened slightly as he answered her. "You believe you are standing here alone, but you are not." Daniel folded his arms, clearly losing patience. "Look, whoever you are, this conversation is over." He turned toward Emily. "I think it would be best if you stepped outside for a while until things calm down." The words carried the same dismissive tone Emily had heard earlier, and several nearby guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Adrian slowly turned back toward Daniel. The temperature in the hall seemed to drop slightly as the ancient authority in his presence filled the space. For more than 6 centuries, he had ruled over creatures older and more powerful than any human in the room. Daniel Hayes was simply another mortal man speaking to a king he could not yet recognize. "You speak as though she holds no place here," Adrian said quietly. Daniel shrugged. "She does not. This evening belongs to my wife and to the family we are welcoming into our lives." Emily felt the words strike her like a quiet echo of the humiliation she had endured for years. Adrian watched the exchange with calm patience. Then he spoke again, this time loud enough for the nearby guests to hear clearly. 600 years ago, the bloodline carried by this woman saved the throne I rule today. The crowd murmured in confusion. Some guests assumed the stranger was speaking metaphorically, perhaps referring to an old family story or some dramatic tradition. But Adrian continued speaking with the calm certainty of someone stating a simple fact. During a war that nearly erased my people from existence, a human family chose to protect the life of a wounded king. That family asked for nothing in return except one promise. The room remained silent as Adrian finished the explanation. "I gave my word that their bloodline would never stand." unprotected in this world. Emily looked up at him in shock. She had never heard such a story in her life. Her family had never spoken about ancient vows or hidden histories. Daniel shook his head in disbelief. Are you seriously telling everyone here that this is some kind of ancient prophecy? Adrian met his gaze calmly. I'm telling you that the woman you dismissed tonight carries a legacy older than every building in this city. Then Adrian lifted his hand gently and turned Emily's wrist toward the light of the chandeliers. The faint golden symbol beneath her skin began glowing clearly now, visible even to the humans standing nearby. A ripple of startled whispers moved through the watching crowd as Adrian spoke one final sentence that changed the entire meaning of the evening. This mark is the vow of protection, and tonight it has awakened again. For several seconds after the golden symbol appeared on Emily Harper's wrist, the entire reception hall remained silent. The soft music that had been playing only moments earlier had stopped completely as the musicians lowered their instruments and stared across the room like everyone else. Guests stood frozen in place, their glasses still raised in midair, unsure whether they had just witnessed some elaborate performance or something far stranger. The glow beneath Emily's skin pulsed gently like a heartbeat made of light. Emily herself looked down at her wrist with wide eyes. She had never seen anything like it before. The faint golden symbol curved across her skin with delicate lines that seemed almost alive. A warmth spread through her hand and up her arm, not painful but powerful, like a current of energy flowing quietly through her body. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the murmuring crowd. Adrian Valerius answered calmly without taking his eyes off the glowing mark. "It is the vow that binds your bloodline to my protection." Around them, the whispering among the guests began to grow louder. Several people stepped closer, trying to see the glowing symbol more clearly. One woman gasped softly while another guest pulled out a phone as if preparing to record what was happening. Daniel Hayes stared at Emily's wrist with disbelief before looking back at Adrian. "This is ridiculous," he said sharply. "Some kind of trick with lights or projection." Isabella Harper stood beside him, her expression uncertain, as she watched the strange glow fading slowly from her sister's wrist. "Emily," she said quietly, "what is going on?" Emily shook her head slowly. "I do not know." Adrian released Emily's wrist gently as the golden light dimmed until it became only a faint mark beneath her skin. The room remained filled with uneasy murmurs. Marcus Thorne stepped forward from behind Adrian and addressed the crowd with a steady voice that carried across the hall. "You are witnessing the awakening of a blood oath older than the history of the city." Several guests laughed nervously, assuming the statement must be some kind of theatrical explanation. But the tension in the air remained heavy. Daniel stepped forward again, clearly determined to restore control over his reception. "This has gone far enough," he said. "Whoever you are, you're disrupting a private event. Security will escort you out if you do not leave immediately." Adrian looked toward him with the calm patience of someone who had faced far greater challenges than an angry groom. "Your authority over this room ends the moment you dismiss the woman protected by my vow," he replied quietly. The words carried across the silent hall. Several guests stepped backward instinctively, sensing the weight behind Adrian's voice even though they could not explain it. Emily looked around at the watching faces, embarrassment mixing with confusion inside her chest. She had never wanted attention like this. Her entire life had been spent avoiding moments that placed her at the center of a room. Yet now every guest at her sister's wedding was staring directly at her. Isabella crossed her arms and looked at Adrian with growing frustration. "You cannot just walk into our wedding and start making wild claims about ancient promises. My sister is part of our family, not part of some story you invented." Adrian finally turned toward Isabella and spoke with calm certainty. "Your sister's place in this family is not diminished by the truth of who she is. In fact, the truth reveals how poorly she has been treated while carrying a legacy none of you even knew existed." The words struck the room like a quiet thunderclap. Emily lowered her eyes again as the memories of countless small humiliations passed through her mind. being overlooked at family gatherings, being asked to help while others celebrated, being treated as if her presence barely mattered. Adrian's voice softened slightly when he spoke again. The vow that protects you was never meant to remain hidden forever. Tonight it awakened because you needed protection. Emily looked up slowly. Protection from what? Adrian answered with calm certainty. From a world that forgot the value of the bloodline it once depended on. And now that the vow has awakened, every person in this room must decide how they will treat the woman standing beside me. The reception hall remained filled with a tense silence after Adrian Valerius finished speaking. The glow on Emily Harper's wrist had faded back into a faint golden mark beneath her skin, yet the memory of the light lingered in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. Guests stood frozen in small groups around the hall, unsure whether to whisper, applaud, or quietly leave the room altogether. Emily felt the weight of every stare pressing against her shoulders. Her heart still beat fast, and the strange warmth inside her chest had not disappeared. It moved through her like a steady current, reminding her that whatever had awakened tonight was real. Adrian remained beside her, tall and calm, as if the tension filling the room did not concern him in the slightest. After more than 600 years of ruling in shadows, he had long since grown accustomed to moments when the world around him shifted suddenly. Yet this moment carried a different feeling. The vow had awakened not out of war or danger, but out of quiet injustice. The woman beside him had endured years of being overlooked, dismissed, and treated as though her presence carried little value. And now that truth stood revealed before the very people who had ignored it. Emily finally spoke again, her voice soft but steady. I never asked for any of this. The words carried through the silent hall with surprising clarity. Isabella watched her sister with a mixture of confusion and discomfort. Daniel Hayes shifted uneasily as the attention of the guests slowly turned away from him and toward Emily instead. Adrian answered Emily without hesitation. The vow was never about what you asked for. It exists because someone in your bloodline chose compassion when the world demanded cruelty. That choice changed the course of history for my people. Emily struggled to understand the meaning behind his words. My family never told me any of this. Adrian nodded slightly. That is often the fate of ancient promises. As generations pass, the stories fade until only the vow itself remains waiting to awaken again. Marcus Thorne stepped quietly to Adrian's side and studied the room. Several guests were now whispering openly, their expressions shifting from disbelief to cautious curiosity. One elderly man in the crowd spoke quietly to his wife about historical legends he had once read involving secret societies and hidden bloodlines. Others simply stared at Emily with wide eyes, as if they were seeing her for the first time. Adrian slowly removed the long black coat, draped across his shoulders. The movement was simple, yet it carried an unmistakable grace that drew every gaze toward him again. Without a word, he placed the coat gently around Emily's shoulders. The fabric felt warm and heavy, far richer than anything she had ever worn before. Emily looked up at him in surprise. Why are you doing this? Adrian met her eyes calmly. Because a king protects the life bound to his vow. And tonight, you should not stand alone in a room that once treated you as invisible. The words settled over the crowd like a quiet truth that none of them could ignore. Isabella lowered her gaze slowly while Daniel looked away, suddenly aware that the attention of the room no longer favored him. Emily felt tears gathering in her eyes, though she quickly blinked them away. For most of her life, she had learned to endure humiliation quietly. Yet this moment felt different. For the first time, someone had stepped forward without hesitation to stand beside her. She pulled the coat slightly closer around her shoulders and spoke softly. I do not know what happens now. Adrian answered with the calm certainty of someone who had seen centuries unfold. Now you learn the truth of who you are. And the world learns that the bloodline it once forgot still stands protected. Around them, the reception hall remained silent. The celebration transformed into a moment none of the guests would ever forget. And though many questions still lingered in the air, One truth had already become impossible to deny. Emily Harper was no longer invisible. The silence inside the reception hall lingered for several long moments after Adrian Valerius placed his coat around Emily Harper's shoulders. Guests who had once been laughing and dancing now stood quietly, in small circles, glancing toward Emily with expressions that ranged from curiosity to quiet embarrassment. Only minutes earlier, many of them had barely noticed her presence. Now every person in the room understood that something extraordinary had unfolded before their eyes. Emily took a slow breath and looked around the hall again. The golden chandeliers still glowed warmly above the polished marble floor, yet the celebration had transformed into something far more thoughtful than joyful. For the first time that evening, Emily noticed something she had never seen before. The guests were no longer looking through her, as if she were invisible. They were looking at her with recognition. Adrian stood calmly beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. After centuries of watching human societies rise and fall, he knew that moments like this often carried a quiet power greater than any dramatic display of strength. Sometimes the greatest change happened when truth was simply revealed. Isabella Harper slowly stepped forward from the crowd. Her elegant wedding dress shimmered under the lights as she approached her sister with hesitant steps. "Emily," she said softly, "I did not realize how much I had overlooked you tonight." Emily looked at her sister with gentle honesty. "You did not overlook me tonight. It has been happening for a very long time." Isabella lowered her eyes, clearly ashamed. "I thought you preferred staying in the background. I never asked if that was truly what you wanted." Emily gave a small, thoughtful smile. "I did not always know what I wanted, but I knew I did not belong standing in a corner while everyone else decided my place for me." Daniel Hayes shifted uncomfortably a few steps away. The confidence he had carried throughout the evening had vanished entirely. "I should apologize as well," he said quietly. "I spoke to you with disrespect." Emily studied him for a moment before answering calmly. "I accept your apology. But respect is something people should offer before they are forced to learn its importance." A quiet ripple of agreement moved through the guests nearby. Adrian watched the exchange without interruption. The vow had already accomplished its purpose. The woman bound to his protection no longer stood alone in a room that ignored her value. After a moment, he spoke once more, his voice calm, yet clear enough for those closest to hear. "The vow does not exist to elevate one person above others. It exists to remind the world that kindness and courage can shape history in ways no one expects." Emily turned toward him with curiosity. "What happens now?" Adrian answered with quiet certainty. "Now you live your life knowing that you are not defined by the way others once treated you. Your bloodline carries a legacy of compassion and strength. That truth will guide your future far more than any ancient promise." Emily nodded slowly as the meaning of his words settled into her thoughts. For the first time, she felt something new growing inside her heart. Not embarrassment or doubt, but confidence. The confidence to step forward instead of stepping aside. Adrian offered her a respectful nod before turning toward the exit of the hall. Marcus Thorne followed him as they moved quietly through the crowd. The guests parted instinctively to allow the mysterious visitors to pass. Before stepping outside, Adrian paused briefly and looked back toward Emily. Their eyes met one final time across the glowing hall. Then he spoke one last sentence that Emily would remember for the rest of her life. "Even the oldest kings remember those who choose kindness when it matters most." With that, Adrian Valerius stepped into the night, leaving behind a wedding celebration forever changed and a woman who would never again be treated as invisible.